Alright guys, so chapter 5, the last one. So since we just had a test on this, you should be probably pretty familiar, most familiar with this topic. So, alright, so the first one, arc sine of sine of 3 pi over 4. So, sine of 3 pi over 4 is going to give me root 2 over 2. And then where does sine equal root 2 over 2 in the right quadrants, right? So arc sine is either quadrant 1 or 4. So this one is going to be pi over 4. The next one, arc sine of sine of 13 pi over 10. Now 13 pi over 10 is a ratio that I don't know, but that's okay. So 10 pi over 10 is here. 20 would be over here, right? So 13 pi over 10 probably is right here, right? Now, when I take the sine of that, of 13 pi over 10, I'm going to get a negative value because it's in quadrant 3, right? So I have to think of what angle do I know that has the same reference angle that 13 pi over 10 does that's in quadrant 4, because that's also going to give me a negative y value, right? So the reference angle here is 3 pi over 10. So if I go 3 pi over 10 this way, that's going to give me negative 3 pi over 10, which is in the range that I want. Okay, so I can change this now. Arc sine of negative 3 pi over 10. Okay, so again, remember, when I do sine of negative 3 pi over 10, it gives me a y value. When I take the arc sine of that y value, right, I'm looking for the angle that it occurs at. So it's just negative 3 pi over 10. So you're changing the angle to something where you're going to get the same ratio at. The next one, so this one you're going to need to draw out, right? So the ratio is 4 over 7. So 4 over 7, which then is going to make this is going to be root 33, okay? So when I take the tangent of this angle here, it's going to be root 33 over 4. Now the next one, so tangent of 7 pi over 4 is negative 1, and then the inverse tan of negative 1, again, it's got to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So that's going to be negative pi over 4. All right, so arc cosine of root 2 over 2, that is pi over 4, and then sine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Arc sine of negative root 3 over 2 is negative pi over 3. And then negative cotangent of negative pi over 3 all right, remember cotangent is x over y, so it's 1/2 over negative root 3 over 2, which is then negative 1 over root 3, which is then negative root 3 over 3. And then the last one, I got sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. And then arc tan of negative 1 is negative pi over 4. And then secant of negative pi over 4 is 1 over root 2 over 2, which is then 2 over root 2. which is then 2 root 2 over 2, which is then just root 2. All right, next one is proving the identities. Remember, you want to try and pick the side that looks more difficult. Typically, it has more information for you to use. So for this one, I'm going to start with the left side. So 1 plus, sorry. I'm going to multiply by the opposite of the denominator. So 1 minus cosine, 1 minus cosine. So that's going to be secant 1 minus cosine over 1 minus cosine squared. Now if I multiply the top out, that's going to give me secant of x minus 1 over 1 minus cosine squared is sine squared. Alright, now if you look at the other side, I need secant minus 1, but now I need a cosecant squared. Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the denominator and move it out front. And then I know 1 over sine squared is cosecant squared, which is what you need. And then 91, I'm going to factor the left. So sine squared minus cosine squared. And then sine squared plus cosine squared. So it's the difference of 2 squares. So this just becomes 1, right? And then that leaves me with sine squared minus cosine squared, right? Now the right side I need just cosine, so I'm going to change sine squared to be 1 minus cosine squared, which is then 1 minus 2 cosine squared. Okay, 92, I'm going to get a common denominator. So 1 plus cosine with the first one, and then 1 minus cosine with the second one. So 1 plus cosine over 1 minus cosine squared. Plus 1 minus cosine over 1 minus cosine squared. Now if I put my numerators together, the cosine terms are going to cancel. Just going to leave me with 2. And then 1 minus cosine squared I know is sine squared. And then 2 over sine squared is the same thing as 2 cosecant squared. Okay, 93. This one I think you can do either side. Should give you the same answer. So 1 plus sine over 1 plus sine. So that's 1 minus sine squared over cosine times 1 plus sine. Now the top becomes cosine squared over cosine times 1 plus sine. And then 1 cosine is going to cancel out. The cosine on the bottom will cancel out 1 on the top. So you're left with cosine over 1 plus sine, which is what you need. Okay, 94. I'm going to change everything in terms of sine and cosine. So sine plus, sine over cosine. And then 1 plus 1 over cosine. All right, now what I'm going to do is I want to get rid of these small fractions. So I'm going to multiply everything by cosine. So that's going to give me sine cosine plus sine divided by cosine plus 1. All right, now I should be able to factor the top. Which then your factors cancel, and you're just left with sine x. And then the last one, all right, so I'm going to multiply by the opposite here. All right, so that leaves me with cosecant times 1 plus cosine divided by 1 minus cosine squared. So cosecant is 1 over sine times 1 plus cosine over sine squared. So now I got 1 plus cosine divided by sine all over sine squared, which then if you divide that out, you're going to get 1 plus cosine over sine cubed, which is what you need. Okay, 96. Find the exact value of sine of pi over 12. Okay, so pi over 12, all right, that is sine of 4 pi over 12 minus 3 pi over 12. Now the reason I picked those two is because both of them, 4 pi over 12 is pi over 3, and then 3 pi over 12 is pi over 4. Okay, those two angles are on the unit circle, and they're two angles that I know. So you're going to use their sine formula. So sine of pi over 3 cosine pi over 4 minus sine pi over 4 cosine pi over 3. So sine of pi over 3 is root 3 over 2, root 2 over 2 minus root 2 over 2, 1/2. So root 6 over 4 minus root 2 over 4. So root 6 minus 2 over 4. Okay, so 97. Cosecant of A is 3, and tangent of B is -7. Find the exact value of the following. Okay, so what I'm going to do off to the side here is draw the triangles for the two. So A is between 0 and pi over 2, so that puts me here. Now it says cosecant is 3, right? So that tells me that sine would be 1 over 3. All right, and that leaves me with 2 root 2 as the other value. And then tangent is between pi over 2 and pi, which is here, and that's -7. So remember, tangent is y over x, so it would be 7 over -1, which then leaves me with square root of 50, right? Square root of 50 is 5 root 2. Okay, so the first one, sine of A plus B. So we got sine of A cosine B plus sine B cosine A. So sine of A is going to be 1/3. Cosine B is going to be negative 1 over 5 root 2 plus sine of b is going to be 7 over 5 root 2 times cosine of a, which is 2 root 2 over 3. Okay, so I got negative 1 over 15 root 2 plus I got 14 root 2 over 15 root 2. Alright, so this gives me 14 root 2 minus 1 over 15 root 2. And then that's going to give me 14 root 2 times 2. That's 28 minus root 2 over 30. Right, and then cosine. So cosine A, cosine B, plus sine A, sine B. Cosine A, 2 root 2 over 3. Cosine B, negative 1, 5 root 2, plus sine A, and then sine B. So we got negative 2 root 2 over 15 root 2 plus 7 over 15 root 2. Alright, so that gives me negative 2 root 2 plus 7 over 15 root 2. And then I rationalize. That's negative 4 plus 7 root 2 over 30. So both of those formulas are going to be on the test for you. So you don't need to memorize them. Just need to know how to use them. All right, and then the last four. Solving the equation between 0 and 2 pi. All right, so. All right, I see that on the right side I have cosine, and then on the left side I have a sine squared term. So it's probably best if I change everything to be in terms of cosine. So 1 minus cosine squared minus cosine squared equals 1 plus cosine. So 1 minus 2 cosine squared equals 1 plus cosine. Alright, everything is on one side. That makes it 2 cosine squared plus cosine. And then the ones would cancel out. So you take out a cosine. Leaves you with 2 cosine plus 1. So where does cosine equal 0? And 2 cosine plus 1 equals 0. So cosine equals 0 at 0 and, nope, I'm sorry, pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And then cosine equals negative a half, which will be 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. So those are your 4 solutions there. Okay, next one. You got sine squared equals 6 cosine plus 6. This is kind of similar to the last one. You want to change everything to be in terms of the same function. So 1 minus cosine squared. So that's going to give me cosine squared plus 6 cosine, and then plus 5, which is then cosine x plus 5 cosine x plus 1. Now cosine x plus 5 isn't going to give me a solution because cosine will never equal negative 5. And then, so you got cosine x equals negative 1. So x is going to be 5. Okay, 100. So tangent squared equals 3 over 2 secant. All right. All right, so let's change tangent squared. So we can change that to be secant squared minus 1 equals 3 over 2 secant. Okay, now I want to get rid of that fraction, so I'm going to multiply everything by 2. So 2 secant squared minus 2 equals 3 secant. So 2 secant squared minus 3 secant minus 2. So 2 secant and then secant. Alright, so this would be minus 2 plus 1. Alright, so the first one is when does secant equal negative a half, or when does cosine equal negative 2? That doesn't happen, so that one's out. And then when does secant equal 2, or when does cosine equal 1/2? So your answers, pi over 3 and 5 pi over 3. All right. So again, just use the identity for cosine and secant, and you can use something that you know from the unit circle. And then the last one, 2 cosine of 4x equals 1. So cosine of 4x equals 1/2. So my general solutions would be pi over 3 plus 2 pi n and 5 pi over 3 plus 2 pi n. Right? Now, because I'm doing cosine of 4x, I'm going to divide everything by 4. So now that's pi over 12 plus pi over 2, and then 5 pi over 12 plus pi over 2n. Okay, so I should get 8 solutions here because I divided each general solution by 4. So 2 pi here is 24, and pi over 2 is 6 pi over 12. Alright, so I got pi over 12, 7 pi over 12, 13 pi over 12, and 19 pi over 12. And then from the second solution, I got 5 pi over 12, 11 pi over 12, 17 pi over 12, and then the last one would be 23 pi over 12. So I get my 8 solutions there. Alright guys, so that is the review. Again, look over your tests. Again, I wouldn't recommend doing everything on this packet. It's really just more for refresher. I would really just kind of focus on, maybe things that maybe you're still a little confused on. You know, I wouldn't really waste my time on stuff that you guys can do in your head. Um, you know, and again, if you have any questions, you know, try and come see me, or you know, send me an email. Best of luck.